So, one of the most difficult parts for me of working at a preschool was whenever I had to handle tantrums. It didn't happen too much, but when it did happen, I had no idea what to do. Like, I didn't know how to deal with it. I couldn't do what my parents would do, which would be to lock me in a room until I calmed down. But they were also not responding to me talking gently and softly. And I wanted so badly to understand what was happening and why the child is having such big emotions and they're getting to this point where they can't even control them and they're taking over and they can't control their body. And so I began to look for ways that I can show my preschoolers how what to do when they are starting to feel these big emotions come up. And I didn't know it at the time, but that was kind of the beginning of my experience teaching social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is a pedagogical approach that focuses on the development of skills and attitudes that are crucial for forming healthy identities and healthy relationships. Social emotional learning, or SEL, is a really broad topic, but some of the skills that it encompasses are empathy, perspective taking, emotional competence, emotional intelligence, social skills, things like that. SEL began as an idea in the Child Study Center at Yale University, where Timothy Shriver and Dr. Roger Weisberg developed a framework to understand what SEL is all about. And with other members of the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL, they published Promoting Social and Emotional Learning Guidelines for Educators. And this was the first SEL related book that was published in 1997. The framework developed by CASEL, which is also known as the CASEL Wheel, is a model for understanding SEL, and it includes the following competencies: self awareness, or understanding one's own emotions, thoughts, and values, and how they influence your behavior; self management, or the ability to manage one's own emotions, thoughts, and behaviors in different situations; responsible decision making, or the ability to make caring and constructive choices about personal behavior and social interactions; relationship skills, the ability to form and maintain healthy and supportive relationships; and social awareness, the ability to understand the perspectives of and empathize with others, including those from different backgrounds and cultures. And so these five competencies are situated in this framework within the context of classroom, family, schools, and communities, since they are all parts of contexts that influence learning. There's also some other parts of the model, which are SEL instruction in classroom climate, school-wide culture, practices and values, authentic partnerships, and aligned learning opportunities, which are also factors that can contribute to or that can just influence a learning experience. So, social emotional learning is actually quite evidence backed. There's a lot of evidence supporting the idea of social emotional learning as an intervention. Especially after COVID, the mental health of many children and teenagers has declined. And so, SEL was started to be seen as kind of like a promising path to deal with and to mitigate these kind of effects that began after the pandemic. A meta-analysis by Joseph Dorlac and colleagues shows an overwhelming amount of positive results for SEL programming in schools on social skills, attitudes, social behavior, problematic behavior, and emotional distress, and even academic performance, though that's to a slightly smaller extent. Another meta-analysis by Taylor and colleagues from 2017 shows long-term effects of social-emotional learning in schools, or social-emotional learning programming in schools, regardless of social, racial, or ethnic group. Other studies have also corroborated this and further found positive effects of SEL interventions of schools and in things like bullying and future outcomes such as like employment, mental health, and criminal activity. In this article by Greenberg and colleagues, they refer to these long-term impacts of SEL interventions, and they argue for SEL as a component of public health. And they state that having social-emotional learning instruction contributes to the general goal of public health, which is to improve the well-being of the population. And while CASEL presents SEL as a framework for everyone, they also note that SEL is not a monolithic model and that it's most effective when it's situated and adapted to cultures or contexts. And while CASEL presents SEL as a framework for everyone, they also note that SEL is not a monolithic model and that it's most effective when it's situated for a context or culture. And this is when I can ask my question, which is, are emotions culturally shaped? I'm not the first person to ask this question, but it's very complex and there's no straightforward way to answer it, although some scholars do attempt to. But there's basically two major schools of thought on this issue. There's a universalist approach, which is associated with Paul Ekman, and this approach believes that emotions are biologically innate and they're universally expressed. So culture does not develop emotions, but it's something that we have just by nature of being human. And there is a social constructionist approach, which argue that emotions are essentially a product of culture, and they're produced through language, norms, and meaning systems. But this is an ongoing debate, and there's evidence for both sides. But more recently, scholars kind of choose to combine both, and they have kind of a hybrid approach to this question. Someone who's really important in this research is Batya Mesquita. She's a Dutch cultural psychologist, and she studies exactly this intersection between culture and emotions. And she has a chapter called What Has Culture Got to Do with Emotions? And here, Mesquita and colleagues argue that the experiences of emotions are shaped by culture. And so there are two main parts to this. First is that cultures differ in what they consider it means to be a good person and member of that community. So, because of this, some emotions are more favorable or socially accepted. And usually, these are the emotions that push an individual to act in a desirable way by the standards of that culture. So, for example, in cultures that prioritize individual goals, emotions that push us toward that, like anger, for example, may be more common and rewarded in some sense because they push us to achieve an individual goal. They argue in the book The Cultural Construction of Emotions, to the extent that emotions help to perform culturally central tasks, they will be afforded and promoted. So essentially, Mesquita believes that there's this kind of cyclical nature to emotions that she calls cultural logic. And this just means that people are more likely to experience and value emotions that agree with the cultural idea of selfhood that that culture has. So see how she's not exactly claiming that culture creates emotions, but that culture sort of allows for them to exist and manifest themselves in people in different ways. And so scholars who agree with Mesquita believe that we should be taking a more nuanced approach to emotions and to the culture of emotions. So neither the universalist approach or the constructionist approach by themselves, but a combination of both. Now, aside from that, I want to point out some studies that have looked at different aspects of the relationship between culture and emotion. Another prominent scholar here is Jeannie Tsai, who's at Stanford, and one of her main findings is that culture influences not the emotions themselves, but it influences more how we want to feel and what emotions are considered superior. So it doesn't influence so much what we feel, but how we want to feel, and that this, in fact, differs. And so Tsai provides a lot of interesting examples on how emotions are more accepted or embraced in different cultures. So when she asked this question to European Americans, of how they want to feel. Most of them said that they want to feel happy and excited. But when she asked this question to Taiwanese and Chinese people, a lot of them answered that they want to feel happy but calm. So these groups have a different kind of goal of happiness that they want to achieve. And this is actually really evident and clear when you look at artifacts from these cultures. She compared pictures of people in the US where they have a very big and bright smile, whereas in Taiwan or in China, they have a more calm smile, or sometimes they don't even smile in pictures. There was also a study by Skolon and colleagues where they asked people from different cultural backgrounds to report their emotions at random moments of the day. And they found that in general, European Americans and Hispanics reported feeling significantly more pride than other groups, and that Japanese and Asian American participants reported feeling a lot more guilt than other groups. And so they make a connection of these results to an idea that had been proposed before, that European Americans and Hispanics generally value pleasant emotions more than other cultures. And similarly, Hain et al. Proposed the idea that self-regard might not actually be universal. So they compare how Americans and Japanese participants think of self-regard. So whereas Americans see self-regard as self-esteem and they value it a lot, the Japanese associated self-regard with other values like relationship esteem, public image, and the idea of ganbaru, which is a Japanese term that loosely translates to perseverance. And so the idea of ganbaru is that regardless of the situation or issue, one should devote all their energy into persevering. And that is one thing that is really valuable to the Japanese idea of the self. So aside from the internal feelings and wanting to feel, more can be said also about how different cultures express emotions and perceive emotions and value emotions. One interesting example of this is the expression of sympathy. Tsai also looked at how Americans and Germans think of sympathy differently. And so they observed that when Americans were giving sympathy cards, the cards were often kind of colorful, they had bright colors and positive messages, kind of giving the idea that they're trying to avoid this feeling of grief and sadness. But when Germans picked out sympathy cards, they were really kind of colorless and gray and dull, and they barely had any colors. It was kind of like dying flowers and muted colors, and they were depicting more and more negative emotion. There's also cultural norms for handling disagreement and interpersonal conflict, which they also vary. And bringing back to the classroom context, how we interact with superiors and teachers and older individuals, this is something that varies across cultures. And one study looked at differences in teacher-student interactions in Belgium, China, and Italy, and they found that even though the teachers across these countries viewed conflict and closeness similarly, and by closeness they meant openness and affection between student and teachers. Despite that, they found that among Chinese teachers, there's a common belief that fear of the teacher is often necessary and that it kind of represents respect for the teacher from the students. And they also found that corporal punishment was more openly accepted by Chinese teachers and by Italian teachers, but not by Belgian teachers. Another interesting point is how people react to others expressing emotions. There's one prominent psychology researcher, Ad Vingerhoets, and he studies crying. And a lot of his work focuses on like how people interpret crying and how different cultures interact with other people who are crying. And he's found that Americans and Dutch people, for example, or more westernized groups often react with sympathy, with hugs, or they'll try to comfort the person who is crying. Whereas in more Eastern cultures, for example, Korea, people might pretend that they do not realize that the person is crying, or they might try to get the person to stop crying, especially if they're in public. And there's one more thing I want to bring up about how cultures understand emotions, and that is the way that language affects them. I don't want to get too much into linguistic relativity because that in itself is a whole topic, but the idea comes into play here because we see that different languages have different distinctions or lack of distinctions for emotions. So, for example, some languages do not make a distinction between anger and envy, but some languages have multiple types of anger or multiple types of envy or jealousy or pride or happiness. And so this categorization that happens within language also shapes how we experience these emotions. So, having seen all of this, what we can say is that culture shapes which emotions are most valued, how they are expressed, and how they're interpreted. Culture does not create emotions from scratch, but it shapes emotional experiences. And it does so by assigning their meanings, their triggers, and their values and their norms, not by creating the emotion itself or the capacity to feel them. So, if we consider the diverse ways of interpreting social interactions and emotional experiences, how can social emotional learning be taught across cultures then? Some people argue that the traditional social emotional learning model, as designed by Queso, is weird. And by weird, I'm referring to the idea coined by Joseph Henrich, Stephen Hine, and Ara Norenzayan, where weird is an acronym for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And this term has been used to describe the groups that are often favored and prioritized in fields of research and whose results are assumed to be generalizable for the rest of the population. If the CASEL standards are weird, then that could have so many implications for implementation and practice all across the world that are not addressed by this traditional framework, right? And so I'm interested in seeing how we can take culture into account in the SEL. I'm not the first one to think of this by any means, and in fact, multiple variations of the traditional SEL model have been proposed in order to be adapted to diverse cultural contexts. For example, there is transformative SEL, there's cultural SEL, multicultural SEL, there's character education, and so many other ideas that integrate SEL elements. And there have been multiple attempts all over the world to create a culturally sustaining model of SEL, and I want to mention some of them now. One of the most interesting and intentional interventions of this kind was proposed by K.A. Goodman in New Zealand in an area with big Maori and Pacifica communities. And Goodman proposed integrating SEL components into the Te Wariki curriculum, which is the national curriculum of New Zealand, which is bicultural and already integrates a lot of indigenous values into it. And one of these values is the Maori idea of mana atua, which loosely means well-being in English. And Goodman argued that the traditional forms of SEL don't directly align with Maori or Pacifica epistemic views. For example, in Maori language, the heart is the source of both thoughts and emotions. And so words for emotions in Maori are also often associated with parts of the physical body. And that's something that the traditional SEL framework does not address. Japan also has a lot of really interesting work being done on SEL, and they've been able to adapt it to its cultural conventions. The Japanese school system has a tokatsu period as a part of its curriculum, and the goal of the tokatsu period is to foster a classroom community. And so often students will clean and organize the classroom, have discussions and social activities. And while this is not exactly just an SEL lesson, it is a dedicated time where students from kindergarten to high school learn to create a caring environment in a community, which is a major component of Japanese mentality. There's also a part of the Japanese curriculum called Kokoro no Note, or Notebook of the Heart or Soul. And this is sort of a reflective journal where students do a lot of self awareness exercises, and its goal is to foster emotional and moral awareness. Many interventions of culturally sustaining SEL have been organized with minority groups in the US, and one very special one was the Strong Kids intervention, which was aimed at young African American male students from kindergarten to second grade. And for this intervention, they implemented conversations about race as well as African American children's literature into the Strong Kids curriculum. Another intervention was delivered to middle school Latino students in the US through a combination of the Keeping It Real program, which is aimed at teen drug prevention, and with the Familias Preparando la Nueva Generación, which is a Spanish version of that program. And that program prioritizes family relationships and familial cultural strengths. Mexico also saw an intervention like this in its Yucatan Peninsula, where researchers and indigenous education experts co-created an SEL program with indigenous Mayan oral traditions and activities in the Maya language. And there was also a similar program in Kenya, where researchers had a decolonial approach to an SEL program, which was rooted in the African philosophy Ubuntu, which emphasizes connectedness and the communal experience of togetherness. Similarly, a case in Vietnam used local Buddhist traditions to teach SEL to adolescents. This one was based in mindfulness and meditation, and student practice skills of compassion, acceptance, while celebrating elements of Vietnamese culture. In Uzbekistan, there was an intervention where they began to use modern Uzbek children's literature to bring up conversations about morality and emotional needs. Through these folk tales and stories' main characters, children learned emotional awareness while engaging with cultural artifacts that discuss values of community and bravery. There is one point that is also worth mentioning that comes from a meta-analysis by Lim and colleagues, where they analyzed studies that evaluated impacts of culturally sustaining SEL programs in many different environments. So just like the ones that I just mentioned, both in the US and in other countries. Although there were mostly positive effects, most programs did not have a theoretical framework for cultural adaptation. The few programs that did have an implementation framework were the ones to show the most positive results. And two of these were actually the ones that I talked about in the US with the African American and the Latino students. And most of these interventions that had the implementation framework used the ecological validity model, which was proposed by Bernal, Bonilla, and Bellido. And this is a theoretical framework to apply to culturally sustaining treatments and interventions. And it's based on Yuri Bronfenbrenner's idea of ecological validity. And this model has 8 cultural dimensions, which can be used as a guide to develop culturally sustaining programming. And so having this theoretical model to follow as a guide was really beneficial for those interventions. So that's one consideration, but in general, most of the evidence does suggest that the culturally sustaining SEL programs have more positive effects than those SEL programs that are not culturally sustaining. And so now, while I think about these ecological validity models designed to help culturally sustaining interventions, I think we might find one day that this model is weird and that it's not adaptable to certain cultures. And I think from some of the examples of the culturally sustaining SEL programs that we saw, it's interesting how their practices vary in many different ways, and they're essentially finding their own ways to connect SEL and cultural values. So, for example, some use art, others use traditional meditation, others use storytelling, others use the element of community building. So, there's no one model for all cultures or one SEL practice for all cultures and all cultural expressions of emotions. And so I think my main takeaway is that social emotional learning should be local and relevant, but it can also still be globally informed. And so this brings me back to Mosquito's argument that emotions are not a private process, but they're formed by social and relational dynamics. SEL cannot be standardized because emotions themselves cannot be standardized. And I don't feel that I can make any specific suggestions for practice or implementation for a given culture, but I do think that that's something that each group and community can explore along with their traditional values and folk pedagogies. One quote that I wanted to end with is Vygotsky's idea that through others we become ourselves. Knowing that we need other people and other communities to learn, I hope that we can continue to work on the idea that culturally relevant and culturally responsive SEL is not a fixed program to be implemented and generalized to everyone, but it's an ongoing process of listening to how different communities already teach people to feel, to relate, and to live together and to be a community.